Welcome everybody to a local authors book club event with Elena Taylor. If you know Elena as Elena Hartwell, that's okay. You're not imagining things. She does have more than one name. She writes in different genres, and so I guess she felt that was necessary. Um, we're happy to have you with us, and if we can wait for just a few minutes to ask questions, at some point we'll open it all up. But in the meanwhile, I would like to give Elena a chance to talk with us first. And I did have something here about the author. I thought this is better than my trying to remember it. Elena Taylor worked in theater before turning her storytelling skills to novels. The Sheriff Bet Rivers series, that's the one that this is out of, draws on her dramatic roots. As Elena Hartwell, she writes the quirky Eddie Shoes mysteries, which sound kind of fun. Elena is a developmental editor with Allegory Editing, where she works one-on-one with writers to shape and polish their manuscript. She also writes the Wait, Don't Query Yet series. I assume that's about writing, right?
Yes.
Her favorite place to be is home at Paradise near Spokane, Washington. She lives with her hubby, 3 horses, 2 dogs, and 2 cats. Elena holds degrees from the University of San Diego, the University of Washington, and the University of Georgia. She gets around, in other words.
I do.
And oh, hey, Elena, this is wonderful. You've joined the guilds not too far back, and some of the folks have been with us for many years, but we're glad to have you with us. I'm kind of curious what it's like for you to write in a couple of different genres like you do and what caused that. But first, how about we back up and you can tell us a little bit about how you got started writing and how you were inspired?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's funny. I think probably everybody on here would say that we kind of came into the world as storytellers, right? Like, I don't know that we were ever not storytellers. And so when people say, when did you start writing? I always think the easier question is sort of, when did you actually start putting things down on paper, right? My very first book, I think I was 5. I wrote a book, obviously longhand, and I had, the heavier paper covers, and I stitched it together with embroidery, gold embroidery thread that my mom had. It was fully illustrated. It was a lot of wizards and dragons. And like I said, I think I was 5. And so I truly have always been a storyteller. Even before I could write, I was sort of making stuff up and telling things. I think probably most writers sort of share that. But my professional life, I actually, as you mentioned, I started in the theater. I was a playwright. And the way that came about was, here I am. I'd always been a writer. I went back to college. I had been a high school dropout. I went back to college at 21 and started doing theater and fell in love with theater. And so I was working in theater and still writing. So I started writing plays. So that's really how I became a playwright. I wasn't, it wasn't that I set out to be a playwright. It was, I was a writer and happened to be working in the theater. And I did that for about 20 years and had a modicum of success. I had plays professionally produced and all around the US and in parts of England and Canada. And so I got produced sort of internationally and professionally, not just small companies, but equity houses and things like that. But even while I was having some success as a playwright, I wanted to write a novel. I always sort of was like, wow, but I always wanted to write a novel, And I don't know why I ever thought it was harder than being a playwright, because it's not. Being a playwright is harder. But I finally thought, okay, I'm gonna write a novel. And I wrote, and I've always been a mystery reader. I love mysteries. That was what I was gonna write. And so I wrote my first mystery, and you guys will love this. For those of you that have been out in that query trenches, I was really scared it wasn't long enough because I didn't really know anything about writing novels. I only knew about writing plays. And I'm like, well, I know how to write an hour and a half play, but how long is a novel? So I write my first manuscript and I go off to this writers conference and I met a developmental editor. This was a long time ago. And I, told her I don't know what to do next and maybe we could work together. And we had this great meeting. And she said, well, how long is your book? How long is your manuscript? And I said, it's 120,000 words. And she just laughed and she goes, okay, cut 50,000 words and then we'll work together. She hadn't even looked at it. She just said, cut 50,000 words and then let's work together. And I thought, oh my God, like, how am I going to do that? And I went back. This was like the best immersion into what it is to be a novelist I could have ever had. So I go back and I cut 50,000 words and it's so much better. I realized I had padded and it wasn't paced right. And she knew simply by the description and the subgenre, right? Because I write crime fiction, but I do different subgenres. She could tell it was too long, right? And not just because publishers are looking for shorter books, especially from a debut, but that she knew a first-time writer with a 120,000 word book, it wasn't going to be tight. It wasn't going to be concise. So I cut it down to 70,000 words and sent it back to her and we worked together and I learned so much from her. And as a playwright, I understand dialogue. I understand story structure. I understand what creates tension. I know how to end a chapter making people turn the page, which is how you end a scene in the theater and you keep people in the seat, right? I understood all of that. But I didn't know the conventions of writing mystery, which I learned a ton from her about how that works, including like, don't write a 120,000 word debut novel. But I also learned, this was the other thing. So now that she's read my work, she comes back to me, she goes, I've never seen this before. She says, you've done something I have never seen before. And this is clearly from you as a playwright. She said, you've got great characters, you have great story, like you understand all of that. She says, but I don't know what anything looks like. And I went, oh yeah, as a playwright, I never had to do descriptions because that's what the set designer did and the light designer did and the costume designer did. I never had to describe anything because other people did that, right, when you were a playwright. And so the two things that I learned from her, which have just held me and have just been so useful for me, was one, right, get that word count and understand pacing, and two, how as a novelist, you are responsible for everything. And I know that sounds like, well, that should be common sense. But for example, I work on projects all the time with writers, even experienced writers. And my notes are, what does this look like? What does this sound like? What does this feel like? What does this taste like? What are the five senses that are being incorporated into this scene? And so that very first novel, which yes, it's in a drawer, it will never be published, but I learned so much from it. Those were the really big things. And I've told this story before, some of you have heard this, but my absolute favorite rejection ever was an editor at a publishing house came back, rejected my novel, but she said to my agent, the descriptions in this book are so great, they function like a character. And I finally nailed it. I finally have gotten over that playwright thing of, well, the designers can fix that. And so that's sort of how I emerged as a writer. Was those two things, was immersed in years of the theater and storytelling and understanding dramatic structure and how to create complex characters and write dialogue and all that. But also finding somebody early on who understands that it's also a business and that you can be as creative as you want when it's you and your computer. But if you want a career, if you want publishers to pick you up, if you want, readers to really respond, you have to understand the other world. What are the conventions? You can't kill a dog in a cozy, right? You can't. You may want to, but you can't. If you are, you're not writing a cozy anymore. or, how there is a business aspect to it. And so I tell writers now when I'm working with them, it's an art when you're alone. It's a craft when you want to sell it. And you have to be able to do both. You have to be able to combine those two. And so that all turned me into a much more practical person who understands the beauty of rewriting. Right. And all of that. And I may have gone astray from your original question, Linda. I kind of got on a
Oh,
roll there.
I was listening and it's fascinating, but I was wondering what, how did you determine what genre you wanted to write in?
Yeah, great question. So my first series, the Eddie Shoes Mysteries, they are a private eye, and it's a very quirky mother-daughter crime-fighting duo. And they were not the first, obviously not the first books I wrote. In fact, I wrote All We Buried, which was not published before them. I actually wrote All We Buried before I wrote my Eddie Shoes books, and didn't go anywhere. And I wrote my Eddie Shoes, and it came from my absolute love of Sue Grafton. And she was the first, for anyone who doesn't know Sue, I think most people know Sue Grafton, but she wrote the A is for Alibi, B is for Burglar. And she was the very first author I embraced on my own. I think I was 12 when I found Sue Grafton. And prior to that, my grandmother introduced me to mysteries. So I was reading Tony Hillerman and Agatha Christie and the stuff that was on my granny's bookshelf. And we watched the Rockford Files together. When I was a little kid, Granny and I watched the Rockford Files. And so the first Eddie book was the fourth book I wrote, fourth manuscript I wrote. And I always say that Eddie Shoes, if Jim Rockford and Kinsey Melhone had a love child, it would be Eddie Shoes. And it really was that combination of these characters that I had been steeped in as a very young person. And it's my sense of humor. They're funny, they're light, they're quirky. And I got on a 3-book deal with my original publisher, who I'm no longer with, which is another story that I can tell. But so I had written them, but I kept coming back to All We Buried, which had a different title, but I kept coming back to All We Buried, which is very dark, very atmospheric. And I thought, I really want to have that book have a life. And my Eddie books went out without an agent. I got an agent, and she sold All We Buried. And so when that happened, my editor at the publishing house for All We Buried, she came to me and she said, we can't take this out under the name Elena Hartwell. And I said, well, why is that? She goes, because everyone will think it's funny, because the Eddie Shoes books are really funny, and everyone will think it's going to be funny, and they're going to be disappointed because it's not funny. And I was like, no, I don't believe that. Of course, we just tell everybody it's dark and atmospheric. So I'm having a conversation with a friend from college, and I said, yeah, I've got this new book, and it's very dark. And she goes, oh, but it's a little funny. And I said, no, it's not. It is dark. No, but it's a little funny. Come on, Elaine, it's you. It's funny. And we have this I literally am arguing with her about my own book that it's not funny. So I get off the conversation with her, and I called my editor and I said, you're right. We can't put this out under Elena Hartwell, because if I couldn't convince somebody who knew me personally that I know my own book better than she does, it certainly wasn't going to go out and have readers expect it to be serious. So that's how I ended up writing both genres, because I'm I have a very wide range of crime fiction. I read cozies, I read police procedurals, I read thrillers, I read horror, I read, for fun. And so the idea of only writing funny private eye felt restrictive. I wanted to have that ability to write in these different genres. And because it's all under the crime fiction umbrella, I don't fall into that category where it's so far out I have to start over with my audience. A lot of people who read my funny private eye are willing to go with me into these darker books. A lot of people that read the darker books are willing to go into the funnier private eye. So it's not like I suddenly started writing sci-fi romance, right? Or, something that would be completely different audience. But it was something that, you know, I had to think about in terms of you're writing under two names. Do you do two websites? How do you handle social media? What do you do with, you know, all of that was something to navigate. So it's been interesting to sort of see how those things interact.
So, well, how about for, I know we have at least one person here who is not a writer. She is a reader, so she comes to
Yay.
this group for that purpose. And she's sort of your guinea pig, I guess, for all this stuff. Sorry about that, Sue. And we will have this up on YouTube, and there will be other people who, because I'll list it under also the readers part of my settings up there. And so, how about let's talk about this book a little bit. Um, it's the second. Yeah, I realize in the first book, your main character, who is, I keep having to go back here, Bet Rivers.
Bet Rivers.
Yeah, she solved her first crime. And I know that the setup for this book is that she's now the sheriff, and she's following in the footsteps of her father, who is now passed, and the family has been pretty much in the line of the sheriff all since the town was put together.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about Bet Rivers. Why that character? Why did you want to write about a female sheriff?
Yeah. Great question. Um, you know, it's funny. I think of being a writer as a kind of alchemy. There's sort of this magic that happens where it's a combination of things come in out of the ether that you can't possibly understand, and then applying craft to that magic. So Bet came to me very formed. I had a kind of, you know, I do a lot of daydreaming. I always say you got to honor the mole, right? MULL, you know, mulling things over. You have to honor the mole. And so I daydream a lot, and I mull, and I you know, it's part of why I like taking care of my horses, because you can be out, you know, doing the shoveling of poop and let your mind go, because you don't have to spend a lot of concentration on picking up horse poop. So I had this character just sort of came to me of, you know, that she's you know, this long line of, it's always been the men in her family have always been the sheriff of this tiny town, but now she's in line. And in the first book, I'm not giving anything away, her father's already has died, and she has gone from being interim sheriff when he's sick to interim sheriff with him gone, and she has to decide, am I going to stay in my tiny hometown and pick up these reins? And I just sort of knew that about her, that this is who she was. And she just became very fully formed, including I knew her name was Bet, and it was short for Elizabeth, like from the moment that I pictured her. And so I knew that with book one, and I knew I wanted it to be a series. I wanted to see her evolution as a sheriff, and embracing you know, her family history, but also that all the sheriffs before her lineage, they had all been men. And so she's not the sheriff her father was. She can't be. She's not him. She's not that. And the community looks at her differently. Her experiences are different. She's the only one who, you know, went to Los Angeles and wanted to be a police detective in LA and all this. And so she's a very different person. And so I also knew that I wanted this sort of grappling for her, as I think we all do, of who am I in the world? How am I different from people who came before me, or my parents, or, you know, others who have held a job? Who am I in this job, and how do I make it my own? And so I investigate that in the first book, but it's really coming to fruition here in the second, as she you know, makes this decision to stay in that small town. I'm not giving anything away, right? Because the second book is in the small town, so you guys can figure that out. But just that sort of exploration of who she is. And I like those psychological character investigations as much as I like the mysteries. So I want the plots to be twisty and ahead of the readers and complex and interesting and engaging. But I want to marry that with a character that evolves. And so that's really where what I set out to do with this character.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Well, you did a good job. She's a good
Thank you.
character, all right.
Thank you.
How about we probably got some folks who would love to ask you some questions or comment, and you know, we'll let everybody open up their audio if you want, but try to be sort of, you know, polite, not run over top of everybody. So go ahead if you have something you'd like to ask. Hi, Patrick. Go ahead.
Elena, the first thing that jumped out at me when I read the synopsis to your book was, what in the world did you do to learn about a small town sheriff's office, how it works?
Yeah.
And then the police procedural
Yeah.
aspect of that, which must be remarkably different than a big city cop.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So when I wrote my Eddie Shoes books, the romantic interest for my private eye is a police officer. And she interacts with the police. So from the very beginning, from the very first book, I work with a guy named Diego Zanella, who is very hot. He's Italian, and he's a major crimes. He has been a major crimes task force police officer in over on the Seattle side. Incredible wealth of experience. He was special services in Italy. He came to the US. He's been a homicide detective. He's been, done undercover. He's done major crimes. He knows it all. And I walked into the Issaquah Police Department. I lived on the west side at the time. I walked into the Issaquah Police Department. I said, I've written this book and I would love to talk to a detective. I want to run some stuff past him. And they said, we'll put a, bulletin out, see if anybody wants, they can call you. He reaches out to me. He says, my niece is an author. I know how hard it is. I'd be happy to sit down with you. I have worked with him on every single book I've ever written. So the way I have approached it, and I love your question because it's such a good one. The way I have approached it is I do a ton of research. I read I've got nonfiction books on police procedures sitting on my bookshelf. I read true crime. I watch things like Forensic Files, the kinds of stuff that are factually based. So I do all that as background. I write my books the way I want them to be. And then I flag all the police procedural stuff and I sit down with Diego and I go, okay, in this scenario, here's what happens. And we have what I call the always, never, maybe rule. If a police officer would always do something, I make sure that happens. They would always frisk them before they get in the car, or, they would always run a background check on a license plate, something like that, where they would say, I would always do that. Then I make sure they do that. If they would never do it, then I have to rewrite a scene so that whatever it is I have created, and Diego, sometimes he'll do this. He'll say, no, Elena, you can't do that. Like that would never happen. So I'll rewrite around that. If he says maybe, then I get to keep it. If he's like, it's not common, but yeah, you might, and it's a good dramatic moment, I'm going to keep it because it's legit enough. So that's sort of the balance that I have with him. Now, it's impossible for fiction writers to always get everything right. And even Diego, like sometimes I've asked him questions and he's like, I don't know, I've never come up in my, experience or whatever. And then to finish the second part of your question, to extrapolate it out to a small town, I went over and with the first book, and it's based a little bit on Rosalind. Some of you may know Rosalind, Washington, which is that little town with like, if you read the books, you'll realize, oh, she's got this huge cemetery with all the different, I stole stuff from that. So the town is not real, but it has some based in some reality. So I went over to Rosalind and Cleellum, and I spoke to police officers in those towns and asked them about things like isolation and when they, they don't have a lot behind them. So I have police procedural from nonfiction stuff I read. I have my police officer who I run everything past and hope that I have flagged all the right things. And then I have done some research into what it means for small towns. And then I've also, lastly, I've extrapolated out. So for example, I do research on things like there's a lot of communities in the US that do not have an ambulance. There is no ambulance. They don't have one. So if someone has a heart attack, they're going to die, right? Or maybe a friend is going to pick them up and haul them 2 hours to the nearest hospital, but the likelihood is they're not going to make it in comparison to people who are in large health. So for example, in the second book, I have a character who now runs a private ambulance service. That is absolutely accurate for a small town. So I'm also doing research about the other complex, and I've lived in small towns, right? I'm in Spokane now, obviously, so we have a ton of people. But I have lived in other small towns. And so I have a sense of what that means, where you're like, oh, I can't get an ambulance where I live, or it's going to be a long time before I get a hold of somebody. And I think, the small town thing is so fascinating because most people are used to be able to call 911 and have someone there in 5 minutes. And that's not true in a lot of rural communities. So I think I answered the question.
You did, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Joan, I think you had something you wanted.
Yeah, since your audiences are so different for both of your books, how did you start getting your audience? Did you have a set goal at first? And how did you start getting your audience for different books?
Great question. I have I think of my life as a Venn diagram, right? My professional life is a Venn diagram. And so I have people who read Funny Private Eye, people who read police procedurals, and people who I know as a developmental editor. So I teach a lot of workshops. I go to a lot of conferences as a writer, but I also go as a developmental editor. So I go to writing conferences and introduce people in terms of writing craft, some of whom then buy my books. So that sweet spot in the center, right, is the crossover of those three things. So to make that happen, when my Eddie books came out, right, I started my newsletter, I started on my social media, I started my blog, and I do all of those things, right? I have a website, I do a ton of events. And, the nice thing is a lot of crime conferences, crime fiction conferences like Left Coast Crime, those readers run the gauntlet. Right. So you can go to conferences like Left Coast Crime, and some people just want to read my funny books or just want to read my serious books, but I can reach both audiences at the same time. Right. So, so I fostered a following with Eddie Shoes. When All We Buried came out, I continued to foster that group, introduced them to All We Buried, and then also had the promotions and the things, the good reviews, and the social media and the kinds of promotions that I could do for that book. But it is that Venn diagram, right? The people who buy both of my books are kind of in the middle of that. And then I have on either side, I only do one single newsletter. So people who aren't interested in Bet Rivers are not going to click on the buy links, right? But they're still going to get, the sales of my Eddie books are on sale, for example, on Kindle. And so they're going to get that. And so it's that combination of combining readers, crime fiction readers across the different subgenres. And I bring people in as a developmental editor who teaches a lot of workshops and engages with a lot of writers. And I go to a lot of conferences, things like that. Does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah, it does.
Good.
Do you do your developmental editing? Is that for crime novels? Or
no, I actually do quite a lot of different genres. I do a lot of memoir. I do a lot of crime fiction. I'm currently working on a sci-fi because I read outside my genre as well. And I know the conventions and all of that. So I do some sci-fi. I have done, this is one of my favorite. I did a gay erotica, talk about a blast to read. So I've done that. There's not a lot I won't do. I'm thinking if there's, I'm trying to think if there's any genre that I absolutely wouldn't do. But no, as a developmental editor, I have a pretty broad expanse that I work on.
Debbie, you seem to have your thing off.
Yes.
If you want.
Yes. So Elena, it's nice to see you again.
Yeah, you too. Hi, Debbie.
Hi. I had bought her craft books, and I work with another set of authors that also took her craft books to heart. And if you haven't seen them, they're like 8 exercises in each one of the books. But you apply it to your own work, and it's been really beneficial.
Yay.
But that's not
Thank
even
you,
my
Debbie.
question. So when you started, so I'm just getting to the point of getting my first
Yeah.
book out. And I have garnered a small following, giving them short stories as I go. I write middle grade. And so my question really is, how much did you find it was worth building before you got your actual first book out there? Because I hear a lot, and I'm trying to do that. So when I get my launch, I've got somebody to launch to.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I would love anything you have to say.
Yeah. So I think of author platform like planting a tree. You all know the saying, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. Right? And the second best is today. So I always tell authors, build your platform, build your platform, build your platform long before your book comes out. Always, always. Because exactly what you said, if you wait until you have a book out, who are you going to sell? You know, who are you marketing your book to? You don't have a following. In addition to that, for anybody who wants to go the traditional route with an agent, with a publisher, a platform does not sell your fiction to an agent or editor. But if they're looking at your book, your manuscript, and they're looking at another manuscript, and they're equal in their interest, they are more likely to say yes to the author with the better platform. Because think about it, right? When an agent looks at a manuscript, their first question is this in my wheelhouse, right? Is it the genre that I carry? Number 2, do I love it? Am I excited about being tied to this book for the life of this book? Am I excited enough to want to go through rewrites with this author, and then the hard work that they do of taking it out on submission, right? So it's got to be in their wheelhouse, and they've got to love it. The third is, can they sell this book? And that also means selling the author. So for example, my agent and I, we were out with a submission on a suspense novel that I have. And we had a big 5 publisher who loved it, loved the book. Her assistant loved the book. They were so excited about it. And they went to the marketing department, and the marketing department said, I don't think we can break her out enough for us to pick this book up. Now, if I had had a bigger following, I might have gotten a different answer, right? But I don't have 10,000 followers on Instagram. I don't, right? I work at it, but that's not who I am. And so I always say to authors, nobody cares you don't have a book out to build a platform. Nobody cares you don't have a book out. If you're out there going, hey, I just read this great book, here's a review, here's my recommendation. If you're giving books away, right? And you say, well, how am I going to give books away? Every one of you, if you wrote to me and said, hey, I'd love to give one of your books away on my social media, I'm going to say yes to you, right? Because that's marketing for me. So, you send a note to an author you love and say, hey, I've got a copy of your book. Are you willing to autograph it for me? I'd like to give it away on my, in my newsletter. They're going to say yes, right? They're going to send you a sticker with their autograph on it. So there's so many ways that you can build a platform. your platform is not about selling your book. Your platform is about showing readers who you are. And you can do that whether you're selling a book or not, because that's what social media is. So you're, posting pictures of your hobbies, you're posting pictures of books, movies, whatever that you love. And you want to do that now. I cannot put enough emphasis on that. The number one way, and we know this from studies in the industry, the number one way for authors to help sell their books is a newsletter. And if you think about it, it's common sense. It is the one and only social media platform you have where the people have self-selected that they're interested in your books. Right? Any other social media platform, people follow me because they like pictures of my horses. They're not all going to buy my book. People who follow my newsletter are interested in my work. And that's different, which is why newsletters are so incredibly important. So start that newsletter. And yes, it's not going to be about your books because it's not out yet. But it's going to be, hey, here's a similar book to mine that I really loved. Right? Here's a topic, here's illustrations by my artist, right? You've got some great stuff that you can have. And newsletters don't have to be big. It's a couple paragraphs and some photos and you're good. People are gonna start picking them up. So great question. And yes, start, if you haven't already done it, work on your platform now. Thanks for asking.
Any other questions?
Ooh, so if I could piggyback on it real quick. So one of the things that I did, so I've been working on this for like ever, trying to get the first book out the door. But what I found in the last 2 Christmases is I did book lists because I'm reading my genre like there's like no tomorrow. And I thought that might be a way to, tell the authors that I'm putting their book on my book list, by the way.
Yeah.
And then I send it out to my small following who are looking for books like that anyway, because I found that it's insatiable. None of us read a book and say, oh, well, I'm done. I've read every book, that I ever am going to read. Everybody's always on a hunt. And so I found that I get about 50% response from the authors by trying to find them. Not all of them are findable, but trying to reach out. So is there any other additional way that I can, incorporate the authors so that I can spread the newsletter, I guess, or
tag them on social media.
Okay.
Tag the author on social media. If somebody tags me and says, I love this book, I'm going to respond to that and I'm probably going to follow them. So follow those authors and tag them on social media. All press is good press.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other comments of your own experiences or questions for Elena?
I'm going to ask a question that is out of step with whatever everybody else is asking. And it's thanks to the New York Times. You're organizing a dinner party. What 3 writers, living or dead, would you like to invite to that dinner party?
I'd have my dad, who I lost in 2019. And he was a writer. He was a law professor and he wrote articles for that. But at the end of his life, he started writing fiction. He was never a fiction reader, but he started writing fiction at the end of his life, which was very interesting to me. So he's been gone 5 years. I'd invite my dad. I'd love to have some of the really older writers that we know nothing about, like Afra Ben, or there's a woman who was the blank on her name. She was considered the first female playwright. And I would love to know what it was like to write in the Middle Ages. Like, how cool would that be? I may come up with her name. I think she was from 1100. And she was a nun and a playwright. And I think, wow, wouldn't that be cool to have a conversation with her? So I'd have her, and maybe Dorothy Parker for fun. She would add the wit. I'd bring Dorothy Parker in. Wouldn't that be an interesting group there? So a woman from 1100, my dad, and Dorothy Parker.
I think Dorothy Parker and the Nun would be interesting.
Right. My dad was quite a character. I think you'd find him entertaining as well.
Sounds like you have a reason for your humor in your book. Yeah.
Yeah, I do. My dad and I were eerily alike. We would sometimes come up with responses to things, and they would be identical, and everyone else in the room would go, "How did you not only come up with that, but come up with it simultaneously?" Our joke, which was funny until he got Parkinson's, our joke was we shared a brain, my dad and I. So, yeah.
Have you've written some nonfiction things like writing, because your book's about how to write and all that.
Yeah. So I have my little short guides. One is called The Foundation of Plot, and one is called The Construction of Characters. And it's as Debbie mentioned, it's a sort of a series of exercises along with sort of aspects of building character, aspects of building the plot that you can apply. It's meant to be very experiential. I taught for 20 plus years on the college level. I was a college professor, along with being a writer and working in the theater, because I was a theater professor. I actually worked in the theater department. And so teaching has always been sort of an aspect of what I do. And so I put those into these guidebooks.
What name do you have those under?
Those are under Elena Hartwell.
Okay.
Yeah, those are under Elena Hartwell.
Patrick?
When you, in your murder mysteries or police procedurals, do you start with the crime, conceptually, do you start with the crime and then work backwards to create your story?
That's a great question. I tend to, I even if it's a first book in a series, right? I kind of have that main character first, so I know who the character is. And then I tend to have a scene float up, literally with All We Buried, because it starts with a dead body floating in the lake. But I tend to sort of have this sense of here's the dead person. I don't know who they are or why they're dead, but that's who shows up next. And then I like to, again, I go back to that sort of that mulling. This is before, and maybe I've written down a first scene, but probably not. I'm going to give time to let it sort of gel. And I'll kind of think about how it ends. How does this book end? And then I probably sit down to write, and I write that opening, and I write that finding the body if it's not in the first chapter. And then I write that ending. And then I go back and I write sequentially unless I get stuck. And then I write a scene and I pop it in and write around it until all those parts meet up. So for example, I might write the climax before I've written all of the middle, right? Because it gives me something to shoot for. And I kind of go back and forth, and my typical process is like, I write chapter 1, then the next day I read and I rewrite chapter 1 and write chapter 2, and then I go back and I rewrite chapter 1, chapter 2, write chapter 3, and I'll sort of do that for 50 or so pages. And then I'll just go back maybe to chapter 6, right, and move forward. And then anytime I have to be away from it, I go back to page 1, and and so by the time I have a first draft, I may have rewritten chapter 1 40 times, 50 times, and even the middle chapters have been written several times. And so my first draft is usually pretty solid because I've done all that. But I think the biggest mistake I see writers make, both myself and writers that I work with who come to me and say, oh, I'm stuck. And I'll say, well, how's it end? I don't know. That's your problem. Can't get there. You can't get there from here. I think knowing how the book ends is just so key for most of us, that we even if it changes, doesn't matter. If it changes in rewrites, you got to have something to write towards, in my opinion.
There are some authors that I've either listened to on some event or have visited with us who say that would be a very different way of doing it, because they always suggest write the whole thing in a draft,
Yeah.
and then go back and edit. Don't edit while you're writing, which,
Yeah.
because some people can get so stuck on editing that they never get anywhere.
Right. But I don't consider it editing. I
Pardon?
don't consider that process really editing.
Oh.
I'm writing a first draft. I am
Okay.
writing a first draft. But what I'm doing is I am immersing myself in the world and immersing myself in the world and immersing myself in the world. So I'm staying on top of what the character wants, what the character's after, what the character's moving towards, right?
Mhm.
And when I say rewrite, it's things like I might have a realization that what I wrote yesterday had an impact on that first chapter. So I'm going to tweak that a little bit, but I do not by any stretch of the imagination get caught up. I don't stay in chapter 1 and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. That's a mistake. That's a huge mistake. What I'm doing is I'm getting back into the world and working on that flow and moving the story forward. And that's why I don't go back to page 1 after I'm, 40 or 50 pages in, because it's too much time. Right. I just read that chapter. But what I'm doing is I'm always writing forward. Yeah. Actually, what you said is super important, Linda, which is anybody who's in chapter 1, right, over and over and over again, and not moving on to chapter 2, they're going to get stuck. And that's what I think those other writers are talking about. Yes, I'm actually doing that, where I'm just moving forward on that first draft. But I stay in the story by going back over and moving forward and back over. But I never just do chapter 1 over and over and over again. I would never do that.
That's a great clarification. Thank you.
Yeah. No, good question. Really good question.
What do you think in terms of the people that you would reach out to, the professionals that an author should reach out to? Is there a priority of, like, would they want an editor first? Would they want to first try to get an agent, and then what kind of sequence do you think, or is there one?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And yeah, there's definitely a sequence. If a person, well, regardless of whether they want to self-publish or go with a small press or get an agent, go a more traditional route, if you have beta readers, that's super important. So I always say, what you're going to do as a writer is you're going to write and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite until you cannot make a single change, not a single word. If you change a single word, go back and read it again. Right. So when you're at the place where you cannot make any other changes, now's the time for someone else to come in and read your work. I'm obviously very lucky because my beta readers are published authors and professional editors, right? Like, because I've fostered that. But even if you're a first-time writer, if you have a friend who's an English teacher, or you have a friend who reads your genre a lot, and is able to be honest with you, right? Or you're in a book club like this, or you're in a writer's club, a writer's group, you can find people to beta read for you. And you don't have to take their advice, but you do need to hear what they say. So for example, if someone comes back to you and goes, I didn't like this character. All right, well, that's subjective. But if they say, I didn't understand this chapter, right? Because your character, went from A to Z, that you have to pay attention to. And it allows you to have that outside eye. Now, in my opinion, and I say this as both a writer and a developmental editor, if you're a first-time author, you need a developmental editor. Come and work with someone like me. You need it, because unless you've gotten an MFA in creative writing, or you've had a ton of workshops, there's stuff you don't know, right? And so probably working with a developmental editor is a really good idea. If you're going to self-publish, you better work with a developmental editor, right? And then a copy editor and a proofreader. Once you've done that, so if you've worked with a developmental editor and you feel very solid and they feel very solid, and your story is very polished and you understand how it fits into the world, you've got your comp titles. My book is like, book A and book B. then you're ready to query agents. And that would be what would come next. Because if you want to publish with really any good press anymore, it's very hard, even with these smaller presses, to get in without an agent. It just is harder and harder because they're so inundated that first gatekeeper for a lot of even smaller presses is to have is an agent. So in my opinion, that would be next. Once you have an agent, that agent's going to work with you again to polish your book. Agents very rarely, and it would be a big red flag to me if they did, go out on sub with a book without having first work with you, because they're going to know who they're going to try to sell it to. And so they're going to know what that publisher looks for. The red flags for that publisher are things that need to be cleaned up. Their eye is exquisite. And then that's when it would then go out to editors. So if you don't want to go the agent route and you want to go with, there are small presses that you can submit to without agents, and some of them are good. Some of them are, I'd be careful, but some of them are fine. That query process is still going to be the same. I would get it polished up. If you're new and haven't had a lot of training, I would work with a developmental editor. If you have pretty good mechanics, you don't have to have copy edit and proofread. If your mechanics are a little shaky, I would, because here's how competitive it is. My agent gets about 400 queries a month, personally, between 400 and 900 a month. She might take on 5 authors a year. So we're talking thousands of queries, right? So when people say, well, do I really need a copy editor and proofreader? I'm like, well, you're competing against several thousand people. And when it comes to the querying process, all the query letter is doing is getting an agent to read your sample pages. All your sample pages are doing is getting an editor to read the full manuscript. If they look at your query letter and it's full of grammatical errors, they're not going to read your sample. It doesn't matter how good you write. They're never going to get to it because they're deleting 100 other queries that came in that week, right? So we are in an exciting time for writers because there's so many more opportunities than there used to be. We have access into publishing industry that used to be much more closed, but it means that our competition is unbelievably challenging. So you want to, nobody's going to take on a book where they go, well, this has a lot of potential. They're just not going to do that anymore. They're going to take on a book that they feel with a little bit of work they can sell tomorrow. Yeah.
Joan?
So I have 2 questions. What is your daily writing routine, and do you outline first?
Great questions. I never outline, but I have to tell you an experience I recently had. So I never outline. I'm what I call an organic writer. I don't like pantser. I think it's disrespectful and inaccurate, because even those of us who write without an outline, we don't just sit down to a blank page with no ideas, right? That's not how that works. We have all this stuff in our head, right? We've been mulling, we've got character, we've got ideas, and we're working it out on the page. So we're not pantsing it, but we're organic. We're letting that process bubble up while we work. So I'm a very organic writer. But having said that, my agent and I are hoping that that my publisher will take a third bet for his book, but what they wanted was a first chapter and a synopsis. So I had to write a first chapter and a synopsis without having written the book, and I don't outline. We are now on the 5th back and forth between us on my synopsis, and I keep going, oh, wait, I have another idea. Oh, wait, I can fix that. And so my agent and I have been back and forth. We're finally ready. But that was hard for me to write a synopsis in advance of writing a book. So I'm very much an organic writer. What was the first part of your question?
What is your daily writing routine?
Right. So it varies a little bit depending on where I am with a book. So for example, typically I like to write first thing in the morning. So if I am on a deadline, if I'm doing a rewrite back from my editor or from my agent or even from a beta reader, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to spend time on my writing. When I'm not in that scenario, right, where I don't have some sort of deadline, I tend to put my client work first. So I'll sit down and I'll do client work, and then I'll write. So for example, it was a priority to do that synopsis and that first chapter, but I have this suspense book that I've been working on for a while. That's not a priority. I'm not on a deadline. Nobody cares if I finish it or not. So I either sit down and immediately start working on my projects, or I immediately sit down and work on client work. And then I do that for maybe 2 hours. I go out, I take care of my horses, I come back, and then I flip it. So if I've been working on my own stuff, I come back in at 11 and I work on client stuff. But I'm working on client stuff, I come back in and work on my own. And then in the afternoons, I tend to do more of the social media stuff. You know, I update my blogs. I do guest posts, whatever my sort of the marketing work on my newsletter, all that kind of stuff. So that's very typical for me. I tend to write about 2 hours a day. I am not a marathon writer, but I write very quickly in short spurts. I'm not a person that can write 8 hours a day. My brain just, I can't go there. So I would take a shorter period of time and write better than a longer period of time and be not writing well. And then the other part of my process, again, it's a little bit different wherever I'm at. Once I have a solid first draft, I print out a hard copy and I go back through and I make changes longhand. If a scene is missing, I flip the page over and I write the missing scene out on the back of the pages. And then I take that back to my computer and I type in whatever changes I've made. I type in the new scenes and put that in as well. And I do that process over and over and over again. So get it all done and get all the changes in, and then I'm going to print it out again and I'm going to do it again. And I repeat that process. And I tend to have a goal. So if I'm working on a draft, I might do, I'm going to add 1,000 words. That might be my daily goal. If I'm doing an edit on a hard copy, well, I'm going to read 50 pages, right? And so I have a specific goal that I want to hit depending on where I am. If it's, well, I have to have it back to my agent by a certain date, I'm going to do however many pages a day I need to do to hit that deadline. So that's sort of my process. Yeah, absolutely. We have a question in the chat.
Yes. Go with that.
What do you do if you're on a limited budget and hiring a developmental editor is a problem? You go to a lot of workshops that are free, read a ton of craft books and apply that. Reach out to beta readers. Always take it with a grain of salt. I'm a little hesitant. I have very few beta readers and they're very specific. I want everyone who reads my book to be a better writer than I am. And they, so you got to be careful with beta readers, but I would do the craft books. I would do as many workshops as you can. And I would, just gain as much experience as you can, read in your subgenre, and apply that. That's what I would do, because I mean, the reality is it's a craft. Anyone can learn it. Anyone can learn the craft. So, read those craft books and apply to your work. I know. I wish that like everyone could just have a developmental editor. It would make me very, very happy. No, I do not use a read aloud app in Word. Makes me nutty. My husband does it all the time. It makes me cranky. I'm like, turn that on. I don't want to hear that. I don't. I know a lot of people who do. I sometimes read aloud to myself, because when you're reading aloud, you catch, like as a final polish, you'll catch that I left out the word and, right? Your eyes have skimmed over that. But when you read it out loud, you have a tendency to sort of pick up those things. But I don't use a read aloud app. I don't like the voice. It's never the way I want it to sound. So
Elena, I'm just quick, as sort of related to these questions. A lot of people talk to me, they would like to be in critique groups, and most critique groups are set up by groups of people and they're closed, and once in a while one is open. my concern has always been that I've wanted the people who read and give me uh, uh, follow up on stuff and that to know my genre.
Yep.
I don't want people
Yep.
who do romance to be reading my mysteries.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah, which is very smart. And I think it's key. One of the errors I see people make, and this is why I'm always a little hesitant, writers groups and critique groups, I'm always a little hesitant about it because one, if they're not in your genre, they're going to give you bad advice. It will be well-meaning, but it is going to be bad advice because they just don't know how your genre works. And so one thing you can do is be very specific with people. So you can say, look, I know you read romance, so I don't want you to comment on any of the police stuff or any of that, but how do you feel about the character development? Are there holes in the plot? And they can respond to that. Right. So I think one thing you can do if the people that you do have, right, that will beta read for you are not in your genre, just be very specific with them what you're looking for. Because you can read outside your genre and know if there's a plot hole, right? You can read outside your genre and say, this character's voice changed, right? They were very snarky to begin with, and now they're not. Like that is uneven. So even people who read outside your genre can identify, but I would be clear with them that that's what you're looking for. And say, you can say to them, look, I know you're not a mystery reader, so don't worry about, how accurate I am with the police stuff or whatever. And just say to them, I'm looking for you because, I have, English, I know people who are, English professors, and you can get stuff from them about structure and grammar and that kind of stuff, regardless of what you're writing. So I would assess it by what can this person do for me? What is this? But I just always caution people, don't hand your stuff over to a writer who's not as good as you are. Because we tend to not trust ourselves, and you're better off trusting yourself than someone who, so you always take everything with a grain of salt, assess that feedback. Is this subjective, right? Is this accurate for my genre? It's a tough one. Building up beta readers is tough. But being in groups that read your genre is pretty important, because then at least you can, sometimes you might have one person read it for structure and grammar and one person read for genre, and kind of take a look at those notes.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, we're kind of pushing the time envelope here a little bit. Is there any maybe short last minute question anybody has before we wrap it up? Okay. Well, it's been wonderful, folks. I appreciate you all being with us, and I will remind you that you can go to the chat thing, and next to that word, you can type in those three dots and save chat. The only thing really, other than people saying hi to each other, I did type in Elena's website and also the title of her book that you were looking at, but maybe you already made those notes. So
And Linda, I wanted to let all the locals know that Auntie's has autographed copies of A Cold, Cold World.
All right.
And All We Buried. So Auntie's has both.
Thank you. Wonderful. I wish mine were autographed. I'll have to try to find you in person.
You will. I would come autograph your books.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you. Well, folks, thanks for coming. And I'm sure that if you contact Elena on her website and that she'll be happy to follow up with you if it's something pressing. Okay. Thanks again.
Yeah.
And y'all have fun now. Go write some more. Okay.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Linda. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot myself.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Dan, would you stick around for a minute?
I will head off. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Elena.
Bye.
Both Elenas. Bye. And
Okay.
Jackie. Bye. Okay. I've been doing a lot of thinking about you and your writing, and I didn't research. I was going to look up Debbie Maycomber's books on Edelweiss, but my feeling is there may be a problem because I don't think you're writing in the romance genre at all. I think
Yeah.
there are things called frequently the books like Debbie Maycomber's come under the section women's fiction
Uh-huh.
if it's focused on a woman and her trying to find love and that kind of thing. So women's fiction is one to think about. That might change your approach, you know, totally in terms of who you're looking for to try to, you know,
Right.
interest. And another one would be historical fiction. If you've got your book in the present time, that wouldn't be so much. But if you're writing anything in, you know, even in the 60s or 70s, say, or whatever, going back, then that would also be another category. Just because you're wanting to have people discover love or find love doesn't mean it's romance. Okay?
Right.
Does that help?
Right. Yeah, I've struggled with that. I looked into women's fiction a couple of times,
Mhm.
and what they told me was women's fiction is only women's fiction if it's written by a woman, and I was told that by
No,
several
no.
of the major people in the industry.
That's absolutely not true. Absolutely not true.
I wouldn't think so, but
No.
it was publishers and agents at the conference who said it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so I
I think
didn't
that's
even look at it.
because most men would not approach the writing in a way that would show that they really understood women. And one has to have that sort of knowledge or ability to say, you know, because you're a man and
Yeah.
your reaction to experiences isn't going to be the same. As much as we try to imagine that we're all the same these days, that's not true. So,
Yes.
you know, and I would try, I don't know if you've read, I think Debbie's, I'm going to look it up and then email you about it, but I think Debbie Maycomber writes women's fiction, but it might be under something else because there are some like, do your books take place in a small town, for instance, or in the rural? Because there's, I mean, believe it or not, rural fiction and family fiction and so many different things. So,
Yeah.
things to choose from.
I
But
know I've read many of Debbie's books. And
mhm,
very few of them would qualify as romances, if
no,
any.
no,
In that they don't they have there's always a love story of some kind, and
yeah.
sometimes it's just two people who are married and love each other and trying to deal with conflict. Sometimes
Well,
it's strangers meeting, but
yeah.
it's not the
Let me
traditional romance.
Let me tell you that all the book reviews that I do, I get stuff that's translated from other countries. I get stuff about, I mean, because it wouldn't matter if it was a gay couple, it wouldn't matter, you know, who the people involved. It could be young people, it could be older people, could be people that used to know each other, but it's been 20, 30 years. You've got a wide range of character types that you can write about love, finding love, looking for it. Romance only comes in if it meets those criteria for that. And those
Yes,
to be, yeah,
yes,
no, I don't have to tell you about those. So anyway,
yeah. I
I would
wouldn't think.
say,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, look a little more about some of this, and I'll try to do the same. I'll do some searching on Edelweiss, which is our professional place where we place book
Oh
orders
yeah,
and stuff,
yeah.
and see if I can't, you know, whoops, here we are. We're okay. See if I can't identify some other writers that you might want to look at just to see, you know, what you think of them.
I know there's been a few books I've read that people would consider romance, but they don't seem to match. Like Eric Siegel's love story.
Mhm.
It's it doesn't have most of the tropes that are supposed to be in a romance. It's two people, they meet, they fall in love, they have a wonderful life. She has cancer, she decides not to take the treatment,
Mhm.
and that's her choice, and she dies, and he has to deal with that grief.
Right,
That's
right.
not a romance book.
No, it's not. And I'd have to look at them to see what other genres they have been matched up with. But there is just general fiction, and so you're looking under that for the subcategory, and then maybe even a subcategory of that would,
Yeah,
you know, match what you're doing. Since I haven't read your book, so I don't know what they would match with. But let me do a little bit, and I'll let you know. I'm still recording. Goodness sake!
Oh.
I hope that's okay.
yes, yeah.
I didn't.
Like